The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chwy.ca/donate. Doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. 4 major new BC ferries are on their way, but plans for a 5th have been rejected for now. The new ships will replace 4 aging vessels, the Queens of Cowichan, Alberni, Coquitlam and New Westminster. It's the largest capital project in the history of BC Ferries. The first of the new vessels is expected to enter service in 2029, with all 4 operational by 2031. BC Ferries had requested permission to build a 5th ship at the same time to increase capacity in the system. All decisions on major capital expenditures for BC Ferries have to go through the BC Ferry Commission, an independent regulator that also sets the limit on average fare and reservation increases. This week, BC Ferries Commissioner Eva Hage released her 32-page decision on BC Ferries' application for new vessels, giving the go-ahead to the 4 replacement ships, but rejecting the application for a 5th. We'll hear her unpack her decision later on in today's show. We'll also hear from BC Ferries CEO Nicholas Jimenez as we break down the decision that's going to shape how Vancouver Islanders commute across the Salish Sea over the next several decades.
My name is Nicholas Jimenez, and I am the President and CEO of BC Ferries.
Well, thank you very much for making time to do this. BC Ferries put in an application for 5 new major vessels. You got approval for 4 new major vessels. What's your reaction?
Well, I have a mixed reaction. So on the one hand, this is a historic investment. This is capacity in our system that is desperately needed. The vessels that we are going to retire are end of life. So we absolutely need to move on from a series of vessels that performed incredibly well, but at 40, 50 plus, one of them is 60 years old, it is time to retire them and bring new vessels into the mix. Where I'm disappointed is that we believe the Commissioner and the Commission missed a historic opportunity to really provide long-term relief to the system. And there's a couple of areas where I think that this decision is at odds with how we understand what the system needs. The first is around capacity. 5 vessels are needed. Our future planning models clearly show that. 4 vessels will not leave us in a place where we can sustainably run the system over the long term. We will absolutely need to revisit this question. And that leads to the second concern around affordability. So the Commissioner described this decision as one that we can't afford, and we disagree. We can afford this. There is a historic opportunity right now to build a series of 5 at pricing that we will not have in the future. So if we go in the future and build 1 or 2, which we absolutely have to do, that's not an option, that is something we will be doing, we will be paying more. So in effect, we are asking people to pay more really to get less in the near term, and they'll certainly be paying more in the future. And that, we think, is short-sighted.
The Commissioner stated in her decision that she errs on the side of your growth projections for how many people are going to be riding the ferries in the future are too high, and that she thinks with this new 5th vessel, if it were to be made, that fares would need to go up by more than the cost of inflation to pay for the extra vessel. And it's argued as well that, you know, just with this new capital project, fares are going to at some point go up by more than the cost of inflation, and that will reduce the passenger demand, which means we won't necessarily need as many ferries on the routes. What did you make of that idea, that part of the report, that part of the decision, rather?
Oh, we struggled with it for a few reasons. One, when we look at where the system is at today, in our summer peak season on our major routes, we're at 92+% capacity. So the system is essentially full. We had 250,000 people over a 2-month period who had to wait for sailings because they can't get on. The provincial projections for growth, and these are provincial projections, we're not making this stuff up. We are using BC Stats data in our planning models. And they are unequivocal and unambiguous that the province is going to continue to grow, and the growth is going to cluster in the coastal parts of the province. And we serve the coastal parts of this province. So the capacity is going to be needed. Now, again, we're looking out many, many years. So these vessels are going to be a 50-year investment. Typically, that's how long we run our ships in the system. So we find it a bit hard to circle that square on, well, you don't need the ships in 2032, you might need them in 2036. Well, it takes 5 years to sort of plan, procure, design, and then build and deploy a ship. So it's not like we can do this quickly on a dime. So the building capacity today for demand that will be there in the coming years, in our view, is the only way you manage systems like ours. And this is true, for big transportation planning entities like TransLink, like ourselves, our counterparts in Europe. This is how these large systems essentially work when it comes to long-term planning.
It was also written in the decision that the Commissioner is of the opinion that BC Ferries has not fully explored all demand management techniques to manage and smooth peak demand. What do you make of that? What's your response?
Well, I'm going to sound very negative again, and I hope people don't mistake me for that, but we struggle with that, and I'll tell you why. And I give the company credit. Before I got here, and in the last 4 years, they really started to look at how we could shift people away from peak sailings. We've moved 17% of our volume out of the peak routes in their peak moments. So we've actually found a way through pricing incentives and scheduling, but mostly pricing incentives, to shift people away from traveling at Friday at 4, Friday at 5, et cetera. That's a great thing. What's happened, though, is that that is filled in. So in as much as we've moved people out, others have come in because there's just a natural and accelerated growth of people into the system. So what the decision doesn't say is, when will you know that you've moved people to the full extent of their willingness to move? You could say that until you see every Wednesday night sailing at 9 o'clock full. Well, the reality is, in a system like ours, 70% of our customers have told us, look, we don't have choice in travel. We are traveling for work. We are traveling for medical purposes. We are traveling, to commute. We are traveling to fulfill supply chains. We're dropping trucks off or moving goods, et cetera. So we only have a certain amount of capacity that we can actually shift, because most people can't change the times that they travel. So our view is that we've hit a diminishing return. So we're going to keep doing this, obviously. We're going to keep using pricing incentives and scheduling changes and other tools in our toolbox. But the idea that somehow that we can demand manage our way out of the growth in the system and get everybody to travel at Tuesday night at 9 and Wednesday night at 9, that doesn't square with the reality of how and when people want to travel today.
I want to go into some detail on the 4 new major vessels we will be getting. So you mentioned that ships are in the system. They tend to be for about 50 years. By the time that these are ready and on the sea, that means, these could be the boats people are riding for the rest of their lives. From what I was reading and taking away, it seemed like the passenger experience side of things was going to be quite similar to what people might be used to on the Nanaimo or Victoria to Vancouver routes, maybe just slightly bigger. I know there are changes in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. What do you think are the big things people need to know?
Well, there's a couple things. I mean, one, we have to be very thoughtful about the design. People don't want cruise ships, and we're not building cruise ships. We're a commuting ferry. Their system runs, for the most part, with the exception of the northern routes, we're running, 1.5 hour, 1 hour routes. 2 if you're going from Swartz Bay to Tsawwassen. With that said, these ships have to last a long time. So we are thinking and being thoughtful about the spaces inside the vessel. So we will have new spaces where people can bring their pets. That'll be a first. So there'll be interior pet spaces. People travel with their pets, even if they're traveling for work or other purposes. It's not just vacation-oriented travel. behavior. We will have a different way of food service. So we're looking very carefully. I think people today, when you talk about food service in BC Ferries, they think lines. Well, we are going to look for technology and different processes to sort of eliminate that and create a different experience. The ships are going to accommodate more passengers, so there will be more seating areas because we want more people to be able to come on the ships. They're definitely going to be more environmentally friendly. So they're going to be dual hybrid ships. What that means is that they're going to run, they'll have the ability on day one to run on what's called biodiesel or B100, which is an incredibly efficient marine-based fuel. And importantly, that they are going to be all electric ready. So that means when we are ready to transition to full battery mode of operation, these ships are going to run back and forth on battery propulsion, which is incredible. The other thing, though, that's important is that they're going to be designed to run in more adverse weather conditions. And I think that's something people are going to be very excited about, because today, obviously, when we make cancellations because of weather, it is not a debatable thing. When winds are gusting and waves are at a certain height, we just can't run because of the safety parameters that we set for ourselves. So these ships are going to be more robust and better able to handle worse weather. So all of those things, to me, suggest, I think, a really improved experience for customers who are using our service.
Has there been any consideration around BC Ferries of potential changes at the level of routes or new types of service, things like passenger-only ferries, that kind of thing?
Great question. So we have spent the last year and a half in this exercise looking ahead 25 years. And it's called Charting the Course. Maybe some of your listeners participated in the surveys. And we're asking ourselves that very question. We said, look, what's really important for this ferry system to be successful? And we heard a bunch of things: reliability, we heard safety, we heard convenience, we heard sensitivity to the environment. And in the context of asking ourselves those future-oriented questions, it's, mode shift came up. So how do we get people, out of cars, finding different ways to use and interact with our service? Now, the challenge today is that a lot of our terminals are in places that can only be accessed or can be easily accessed by cars. It's hard to get to Tsawwassen, by public transit. It's possible, but it's not easy. And so I think in the future, we are going to have to look to how we can service other communities with different forms of travel. And I mean, you talk to anyone on the Sunshine Coast, and that will be true, where, downtown linkages between Gibsons or Sechelt, that we're already seeing that happen between Nanaimo and downtown Vancouver with Hello Ferries. So those are questions that are relevant in the future. They're not questions relevant right now. Right now, we've got to fix the system that we are contracted to run before we can start chasing new opportunities. So we've got a lot of So we're talking a lot about ships, but we have a huge challenge with the state of repair in which we find our terminals. So there's a lot of infrastructure there, and I'm talking about the marine-based infrastructure, the dolphins and the wing walls and the berthing capabilities that we have. These are critical parts of our network that have to work, and a lot of them are really old. A lot of them are reaching end of life, and it's really expensive to do that work. And it's not a question of, well, maybe I'll do it or maybe I won't. You have to do this work. If you can't safely berth a vessel, you're not going to be able to run your system. So when we look at building out new capabilities, we got to fix our existing capabilities first.
To that end, earlier this year, you announced a major upgrades would be coming to the Horseshoe Bay terminal, that in the long run, it would be in the order of magnitude of hundreds of millions of dollars. What do people need to know about the upgrades to the infrastructure at terminals in terms of the timeline and how it might affect them?
Well, I mean, we've got 47 terminals, and right now, I think 30+% of our terminals are in a poor or below average state of repair. We have 50+ terminal projects happening right now or planned in the network, right? So there's a lot of activity happening. So you mentioned Horseshoe Bay, and it's a great example of what I was just talking about. I don't think anyone would get particularly excited about having to spend, a couple $100 million, putting seismic, infrastructure in place to make sure that this will be safe if and when an earthquake hits, to, replace berth 3, for example, or, to address the challenges of the transfer deck, which is aging and really, needs to be fixed. So these are things, again, that are very important to us. They're huge cost infrastructure, but they're not things that people are going to recognize as really exciting per se, because they would just assume that they're there in good working order. And so when we look at the Horseshoe Bay example specifically, the challenge for us is not just to do the work and to do it, in a really cost-effective way, but is to do it and make sure we can run that system really efficiently. Horseshoe Bay is a very complex terminal. We have 3 routes coming in and out all day. It's not like Tawasin, where you can really do a great job in staging and managing vehicle traffic, because it's long and narrow. So it's really hard to actually stage traffic in that terminal. I'm not sure if people appreciate how complicated it is and why there's, frequently sort of operational complexity there. It's because you have to move big chunks of traffic through your network in a way that's not as easy as say, Departure Bay or Tawasin. So we're going to have to do 2 things at once. We're going to have to build the stuff, fix it efficiently, and we're going to have to run these terminals, with minimal impacts to people getting on and off our vessels.
We've just spent a bunch of time talking about billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure needs and upgrades. I'm wondering, if we turn to the other side of the equation and talk about the funding model for BC Ferries, what kind of changes will need to happen, either from just contributions from the provincial government or possibly to the fares?
It's a great question. And it is the question, in my view, as we look at these really sort of generational investments that have to be made into the ferry system. So late last fall, I made some public comments very intentionally to sort of give voice to, we've got an issue inside the ferry system. It's not dissimilar to what TransLink has been talking about very publicly in terms of their operating challenges. And it's not very complicated. The reality is the cost of running the system is more than the revenues we're bringing in. And to run the system, I'm including the day-to-day act of getting 50,000 people to where they need to go. And it's also the amounts we need in order to invest in the infrastructure. So we've described the problem that exists today, and it existed when we established the 4-year regulatory spending from 2024 to 2028. So the government said, we're going to buy down some of the gap that exists today, but we're only going to do it for 4 years. So we just bought ourselves 4 years worth of space, to address the fact that there is a gap. So in 2028, when our next regulatory model, our budget period begins, we are going to start with, essentially a 30% gap, and then add to it the increase in cost that we've seen over the last, 4 years between 24 and 28. So we are going to have to be very careful and considerate and clever, quite frankly, when we work with government to figure out how that system is going to be funded. So currently today, the system is funded about 2/3 from customers and about 1/3 from various sources of government funding, federal and provincial. Putting in 30% or more increases, on day one, is not reasonable, not practical. And we know the system is going to need funds to run. And so we've got between now and next fall, when we have to make that application to the regulator for that 2028 to 2032 period, to essentially put forward an argument and a solution for how the system is going to essentially work when it comes to funding. I don't have the answers today, but I think we're going to have to be looking at a number of different sources. If I look to TransLink, for example, they have many sources of funding that aren't just sort of a direct subsidy from government. So they have access to tax revenue. They have access to a lot of federal funding. We have very little federal funding in our model today, something like $20 to $25 million of the billion plus in revenue that we get every year comes from the feds. So we have to look broadly at where we can appropriately tap into resources to make sure the ferry system works. The ferry system, people often describe it as an extension of the highway system. I think it's a reasonable argument. I've heard people say it's a floating bridge, an extension of the highway system, a marine highway. The reality is it's transportation, and it's not that different from taking a bus, taking a train. It's just in this case, you have to be a little bit more planful about how you take a boat. But it's certainly part of the region's transportation network, how we're going to move people between communities and move goods between communities, because that's another thing people sometimes forget. We move a lot of commercial goods.
How do those budgetary constraints and considerations you were just describing tie into where we started our conversation with this fifth vessel that you were hoping to get that you won't for now?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, and this is the argument we were making. The size of the problem is significant, so that we're not denying the fact that there is a ferry system funding problem. The relative portion of that problem that is the fifth vessel is fractionally very small. So we can afford to build 5 vessels. Rates would not have had to been increased, between now and 2028 when our next performance term starts. We could afford to do that. We had great pricing from the shipyards we're looking at. It was built into our funding program for today. And the relative size of that 5th ship against the total need that we're going to have to address in 2028, very, very small. So in our view, it missed the moment. The decision missed the moment. So the decision accurately pointed out the problem, which we called out last fall. There will be a solution. We're going to advance it, like I said, in our regulatory filing next fall. But not building for future growth today is a huge missed opportunity.
Is there anything else you think the public needs to know about this at this time?
Well, I hope that people recognize, one, we don't get to make these decisions. And as much as we're operating the ferry system, the broad parameters of how the ferry system is designed and funded are really out of our control. That doesn't mean that we're not fighting on their behalf. So I really do hope people can appreciate the work that we're doing, not just to operate the system day to day, but to bring, their interests and their needs into arguments that we're making with government and with our regulator to sort of help bring growth into the system. We hear people loud and clear. They're not saying it quietly. They're saying it loudly. They're telling us every single day what they need out of the system and what it's not delivering. And we don't disagree. So for us, our job is really to advocate on their behalf. We hope we're successful. We're not always successful, as this decision on Monday points out. But people, I hope they recognize that we are really working hard on their behalf to get as much as we can into the system. And when they don't see the things that they want, it's not for lack of not wanting or trying. It's a more complicated decision-making framework that we have to live within.
Nicholas Jimenez, thank you so much for taking the time.
This has been great. I really appreciate your interest, Joe. Hope you have a good rest of your week.
Nicholas Jimenez is CEO of BC Ferries.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
BC Ferries has the green light for 4 new major vessels to replace some of the oldest ships in their line. But the independent regulator who oversees BC Ferries declined a request from the company to build a 5th new major vessel at the same time. We're breaking down that decision and talking about the funding system for our ferries on today's program. Eva Hage is the BC Ferries Commissioner who made the decision on the new vessels. I reached her by phone.
My name is Eva Hage. I'm the BC Ferries Commissioner, which is the regulator of BC Ferries. We are independent from both government and BC Ferries. And my major role is to set price cap decisions and to approve major capital expenditures, like the new major vessels.
Yes, exactly. That's what we're going to talk about today. So recently you decided to approve 4 out of the 5 new major vessels, basically, that BC Ferries has asked for. Could you tell me about your primary reasons for saying yes to the first 4 and then no to the 5th?
Well, the 4 new vessels will replace 4 old vessels. We call them legacy vessels. They are simply too old. Once the vessels get too old, there is difficulty finding spare parts. They do break down more often, and it's more expensive and takes longer to repair them. So the legacy vessels are simply old, and it's timely to replace them. So it's essential for the reliability of the ferry system to have vessels that are not going to break down.
And then the other piece of this is BC Ferries had asked for another new major vessel, and that request was denied. What was the main reason for saying no to that extra vessel?
The major reason is affordability. It was an issue of cost. The long-term effect on BC Ferries' financial situation. Over the last couple of years, costs have increased at BC Ferries, just as it has at many other organizations, and particularly in transportation. And the 4 vessels that replace the legacy vessels are kind of essential to keep the ferry system going, but we deemed the 5th vessel as a nice to have. Definitely some benefits to it. I totally don't disagree with the BC Ferries on the benefits, but simply not affordable at this point in time.
BC Ferries has argued that with growth in the province, a 5th vessel is eventually going to be needed, and that it will only get substantially more expensive to build later. They argue that due to the market conditions and fixed price bids and economies of scale, it would be cheaper to build all 5 now rather than wait a number of years and build this fifth boat rather. What's your response to that sentiment?
I don't disagree that the building a vessel 5 years from now will be more expensive than it is today. But there's also a cost of carrying the debt for that vessel in the meantime. And as I said, we don't necessarily agree with BC Ferries' assessment that the 5th vessel is essential to maintain the reliability and the service of the ferry system. And their argument was basically that they based it on unconstrained demand. There is a population forecast of about 15% growth, comes from BC Stats. We don't disagree with any of those forecasts. What we do disagree with is that historically, ferry ridership has not grown one-to-one with population growth. Population growth is a major factor, of course, but it's not one-to-one. There are other economic fluctuations, currency exchange, etc., that affect the ridership. So we disagree with the forecast that BC Ferries has put on the table that ferry ridership will grow with population forecast, and that it's unconstrained, and also that the growth in ridership is based on fares staying at inflation. We don't believe that fares will stay at inflation. There is a systemic funding gap in the corporation that will have to be filled by one or both of the 2 revenue sources, which is ferry revenues and taxpayer funding through subsidies from the provincial government. And both of them will have to go up substantially due to the financial situation that BC Ferries is currently in. So we don't believe that the demand that is projected on fares staying at inflation will happen.
How do you estimate the fare price as impacting demand? BC Ferries says that 70% of its customers surveyed say that they're making essential trips and that they can't adjust the timing of those trips to, for example, less busy times during peak season. When you're making decisions about major capital expenditures for BC Ferries, what kind of projections are you using on how fares could increase, what the effect on the demand is going to be? How are you factoring those ideas into your decisions?
Well, we're not setting a price cap. The price cap is good for 4 years, and we're currently in performance term 6, and we've just gone through the first year of that. So we have 3 more years of fare increases at 3.2%. But what we did with this rather large capital expenditure, this is the largest capital expenditure in the history of BC Ferries. So we had to look out into the future, 10 years into the future, to see what the effect would be on their debt levels and on their traffic levels. And we did sensitivity analysis on traffic, and also looking at what we think their operating costs will do in the future. Their operating costs have increased substantially. And then we made some assumptions on what the provincial subsidy would be. And it is not my role to tell government how much subsidy to put into the corporation. But what we saw was that there is a substantial funding gap coming up in the next performance term. And part of that is the $500 million that government put in for performance term 6, the current performance term. If you remember 2 years ago when the preliminary price cap was set, I had based the price cap at that point was 9.2% per year during this 4-year term, and government decided that was too high. They put in $500 million and bought down the fares to 3.2%. We don't know if that funding will be available in performance term 7. We have assumed that there will be some funding coming, but even so, there is a big revenue gap, and it will have to be filled with fares, more provincial revenues, and also some cutbacks, reductions in the ferry corporation. And the 5th vessel was one of those. Nice to have capital that just we deemed was not affordable.
It sounds like there's a major degree of political uncertainty that you have to factor into this decision-making process. Is written in your decision, a lot of what you just said, that given BC Ferries' current financial system, you expect the future fare increases to be higher than inflation. I'm wondering how we can have a system where we don't have more certainty built in. So BC Ferries says this is what we think we need. It's your job to say yes or no. But as you're making that decision, you can't know what in 3 years the politicians are going to say as far as how much money they're willing to contribute from the public purse into the ferry system. Is there a better way to do this?
That's a tough question. The model, the governance model, is complicated, and it worked very well, I would say, up to COVID. COVID threw a wrench into the whole system by having BC Ferries had to defer this major capital expenditure for vessels, and after COVID, costs increased substantially. So we're now in a situation where, for example, the 500 million that government put in for performance term 6, the current performance term, we had to defer this major capital expenditure for vessels. And after COVID, costs increased substantially. So we're now in a situation where, for example, the 500 million that government put in for performance term 6, the current performance term, we had to defer this major capital expenditure for vessels. And after COVID, costs increased substantially. So we're now in a situation where, where the fare revenues, or the revenues, period, both from government and from ferry users, just have not kept pace with costs. And there's a bit of a catch-up. And of course, government does not have an abundance of money, and ferry users are feeling the pinch everywhere. So it's I don't know if there is a better model. If there were, I'm sure somebody would have thought about it. But there's uncertainty, and there's something we have to work through.
Is a fair summary for people listening, the way that this has maybe impacted them up until lately, is that going into the last cycle, to keep the kind of balance of how much of BC Ferries money came from fares versus how much came from the government, the fares would have needed to go up a lot more. You said 9% as opposed to the 3% that it's actually been. What happened was the government said, hey, we'll step in and we'll contribute a bunch more money so that fares don't suddenly go up. And that's the situation we're living in until 2028, at which point everyone will have to decide again how much the prices will go up. And your guess would be that it's going to be much more than inflation. Well, more than inflation.
That is my guess. Yeah.
Is there anything else you think the public needs to know about this decision on new ferries?
Only that the 4 vessels will provide quite a lot of new capacity and also improved reliability. And that's sort of the core of the public interest, is to maintain a safe, reliable, and affordable ferry system. It doesn't mean that traveling in August that you can just drive up to the ferry terminal and get on. There's simply too much demand for that. And having a system like BC Ferries, which is incredibly cyclical, I should say, where their peak traffic is much, much higher than what in the off-peak. And building a system that can conveniently serve the peak is very expensive. And that was the part of the whole discussion, which cannot be made public. So, yes, I understand that people want more ferry service, but it would come with a pretty hefty price tag.
Eva Hage, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me on this.
Thank you, Joe.
Eva Hage is BC Ferries Commissioner. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Mid-Coast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Mid-Coast Morning.
Mid-Coast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Mid-Coast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.